So, starting with the first question that we're getting a pretty good clue from the look of this first deal. The Tories are trying to use this, and specifically the kind of European Research Group, the Jacob Rees-Moggs, the Boris Johnsons of this world, they're trying to use Brexit as an opportunity to build this bargain basement business model off the coast of Europe. That means low wages, low corporate taxes, a bonfire of regulation and red tape to create this competitive labour market that basically allows corporations to exploit human beings, to exploit our workers as much as they conceivably can. And this is why they're so keen to get away from stipulations around the level playing field, around kind of workers' rights, all these different sorts of things. And some are arguing that this is what's motivated the European Union to put some fairly strong stipulations in our withdrawal agreement around the level playing field. This idea that the UK needs to be treated in similar sorts of ways when it comes to regulation that the European economies do as well. But there's a reason to suggest that that isn't primarily what is motivating the EU's stance on the level playing field, amongst other things. Last year, the Times revealed that EU negotiators had stated overtly that concerns over Labour's economic policies are the main reasons for the EU's insistence on the level playing field. The EU might be slightly worried about, a Jacob Rees-Mogg Brexit and a UK as a tax haven undercutting them, but they're much more worried about the idea of a socialist Europe, socialist UK off the coast of Europe, demonstrating what true socialist policies could look like to all the other really just disenfranchised citizens across the European Union. The other thing that people often come back to in this debate, and that I end up debating with people a lot, is that none of the things that Labour wants to do in its manifesto would technically be illegal under European law. Firstly, I don't think that's true. Secondly, I don't think the manifesto is as far as we'd like to go. But finally, and most importantly, I think the way that we understand the way the European works should stem from our perspective as materialists. I'm a Marxist economist. I look at the structure of the economy as based on underlying structures of power relations. And I think that works just as much for international institutions as for national ones. I think the fail to see through the veil of liberal institutions to the power relations that underpin them is a failure to understand capitalism itself. And so, the point of having an objective, enforceable legal system, according to the liberal tradition, is the idea that all members of the political community are held to the same standards on collectively determined priorities and laws. No such system exists at the international level, at the EU level, because there are no mechanisms for enforcement. Instead, international law the world over, and European law in particular, has been a mechanism for powerful states and powerful classes to impose their will on other people. And you can see this in, for example, the very selective enforcement of things like the Stability and Growth Pact. This idea that European economies need to keep their, Eurozone economies need to keep their deficits below 3% of GDP. Germany and France face absolutely no sanctions for flouting this in about 2003. And yet when Greece, when Italy, when various other southern European countries attempt to push back, or really just use fiscal policy to push back against the fact that they're hemmed in by this really restrictive monetary policy that's involved in the Eurozone, they get the full force, the full weight of Europe coming down on them. And this is the way we need to understand European law. Not just as a set of texts that judges objectively enforce, but as a mechanism for the enforcement of a particular set of power relations. And that is both the powerful nation states and the powerful groups, the bosses, the owners that underpin that. So, what should Labour be demanding from a Brexit deal if it is the case that the Tories want this bargain basement business model, the EU wants to make sure that we are effectively moving away from any attempt to enforce and create a socialist economy off the coast of Europe? So firstly, and most importantly, we need to make sure that everything that the Labour Party has democratically agreed we need to implement as far as our economic policy goes, is we are able to do post-Brexit. And that means going back to the EU and saying, we need a Brexit deal that allows for expansive state intervention in the economy, that allows for nationalisations, a big programme of investment and a transformation of the way that ownership works more broadly. And we also want, and I think we should argue for actually an inversion of what the government is arguing for. We should argue for expansive state intervention, limits on the mobility of capital, but actually continued free movement of labour. Because this actually, a socialist Labour government with free movement amongst all European citizens could act as a revolutionary force within Europe itself, within a Europe that is currently crumbling and struggling and really bursting at the seams, attempting to contain the massive economic disenfranchisement that its extended experiment in neoliberal economics has created. So I think we should be arguing for extended state intervention, free movement of labour, and no mobility of capital. If we can't get that because the EU insists that its four freedoms are indivisible, then we say, okay, fine, we need to negotiate a deal that allows us to leave the single market, leave the customs union, and allow for mass state intervention and capital controls. And this would require, implementing such a strategy would require an immediate general election, a Labour government coming to power, going back to the EU and attempting to negotiate such a deal. Because the deal we have now on the table, let's just be straight about this, will not allow a Labour government to implement even a very limited democratic socialist agenda. And that's why these are the options that Europe has put on the table. Thanks. So I want to end, just by talking about two things. Firstly, what a post-Brexit economy would look like, and secondly, what a post-Brexit multilateralism would look like, what a socialist multilateralism would look like. So firstly, when we come out of the EU, there will be an initial shock to demand, and that's something that we do need to take into account. But that also provides us with an opportunity. If Labour came to power, after having negotiated this deal, and said, we are going to implement a Green New Deal for the British economy. We are going to implement billions of pounds worth of investment, both to absorb that initial shock to demand and to transform the base of production in the UK economy over the long term. We're going to plough tons of money into green infrastructure. We're going to support manufacturers and exporters that produce and export green technologies. We're going to build green social housing. All these sorts of things that will allow us to both employ huge numbers of people, expand our economy, provide a fairer and equal and more prosperous economy, and also, deal with this fact that we have 12 years to stop climate change. And let's not forget that, the EU sees climate change as this kind of elite-led project, that it can do carbon pricing and, get lots of corporations together around a table to ask them very politely to stop being so bad. But climate change is going to affect the poorest and most marginalised people on the planet much more than the wealthy. The wealthy always have and always will have found ways to insulate themselves from these things. Climate change is a class issue, and I think a Green New Deal for the British economy post-Brexit, a deal that the EU would not allow, will allow us to politicise it, as well as completely transforming our economy, making it fairer, more prosperous and more sustainable. And finally, what would a post-Brexit socialist multilateralism look like? I want to finish with a little story. I was in Geneva a couple of weeks ago addressing the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which is a kind of great non-neoliberal outpost of the EU, set up by a group of dependency theorists who look at kind of the structures of the global economy through kind of Marxist and socialist terms. And I was in this room talking about a report that UNCTAD had just released, which looked at the financialisation of the global economy and argued for a global New Deal in order to prevent, both to kind of, boost demand in the economy as a whole, and also to stop some really regressive things that have gone on in the global south as a result of financialisation. Things like capital flight, tax gains and tax avoidance, and really unfair and unequal trade deals. The G77 and countries, which is a big group of kind of countries in the global south, in countries like Pakistan and Chad, stood up to welcome the findings of the report, saying, really in very, very visceral terms, quite how much financialisation and neoliberalism had hurt their economies. And the delegate from the EU stood up and scolded UNCTAD for having overstepped its mandate. Now, whatever progressive multilateralism looks like, I don't think this is it. As I've said, what we really need to be doing is making sure that we are arguing very progressively for freedom of movement, against the idea that, what really matters is working class people fighting against each other for the scraps handed down to us from elites, and actually coming together to point out that those are the people, the international capitalist class, that are getting us to fight one another rather than fighting them. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're really building a strong argument for free movement, for internationalism, for multilateralism. And then we need to make sure that we are working together with other countries to build genuinely multilateral institutions, institutions that incorporate the voices of the global south, and actually speak out against the practices that hurt those countries, as well as the vast majority of people in the UK. Sub-Saharan Africa loses 3 times more in capital flight every year than it gains in development aid. A lot of that goes to the City of London, the same city that caused the financial crisis, that was integral in causing the financial crisis, that cost this economy between 2 and 7 trillion pounds in lost output, the vast majority of which hurt working people rather than the people that caused it. So, this is the vision, I would argue, I'm probably running out of time. Vision for a post-Brexit economy would involve a Green New Deal on the part, negotiated by a Labour government, and steps towards a progressive multilateralism that brought together working classes from around the world to fight against neoliberal, extractive, financialised institutions like the European Union.